She told him to use the side entrance, not the front door. The side entrance, the one with the dented metal handle and the flickering fluorescent light above it that the building manager had been meaning to fix since February. Neville Osei-Addo stood on the sidewalk in front of the Harrington Tower on a Tuesday morning in late October, holding a manila envelope under his left arm, and read the sign the receptionist had just pointed to through the glass. Deliveries and service personnel. Please use east door. He hadn't buzzed yet. He'd barely touched the intercom button when she looked up from behind her desk, took one look at him through the floor-to-ceiling window, and shook her head slowly. She mouthed the words before he could say a single one. He was 61 years old. He was wearing a gray wool coat he'd owned for 12 years. It was clean. It was pressed. He'd polished his shoes that morning the way his father had taught him. 2 coats, circular motion, soft cloth. None of that seemed to matter to the woman behind the glass. He pressed the intercom button anyway. "I'm here for the Meridian Group offices," he said. 42nd floor. She leaned forward in her chair and spoke into the microphone with the particular tone of someone who has decided something before the conversation even began. "Deliveries go to the east entrance. Down the block, then left." "I'm not making a delivery," Neville said. A pause. She looked at the envelope. "What's in the envelope?" He considered the question for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer, he knew perfectly well what was in the envelope, but because he was deciding how much he wanted to explain himself to a woman who had already decided who he was. "It's personal correspondence," he said, "for the meeting." She pressed her lips together. "Do you have an appointment?" "I do. Name? Osei-Addo. Neville Osei-Addo." She typed something, looked at the screen, typed again. The delay stretched long enough that a man in a tailored navy suit walked up behind Neville, pressed the buzzer without saying a word, and was let through before the door had even finished closing the first time. She didn't ask that man for his name. "I'm not finding anything," she said. "Try under Meridian Group. The meeting is with their board." "Sir, I've told you. Deliveries and service personnel use the east entrance. If you'd like to speak with someone from Meridian, you can call their office directly." She reached toward her desk, and the intercom clicked off. Neville stood there for a moment in the October air. A bus went past. A woman with a stroller moved around him on the sidewalk. He looked at the east entrance sign one more time, then looked back at the lobby, where the receptionist had already returned to her computer as though he no longer existed. He took out his phone and made a call. "Now, before we go any further, if you've ever been looked through by someone who'd already made up their mind about you, you'll understand exactly what Neville was feeling on that sidewalk. And if you've never had that experience, then what you're about to hear might surprise you in ways you weren't expecting. Stay with this one, because the ending is something else." Neville Osei-Addo had come to Toronto from Accra in 1986. He was 24 years old, carrying a suitcase, $200 Canadian, and an engineering degree from the University of Ghana that 3 separate people at the border had looked at with what he could only describe as polite skepticism. He'd spent his first winter in a basement apartment in Scarborough, working nights at a food packaging plant, and his first year taking every certificate course he could find on weekends and evenings, because someone had told him early on that credentials from back home were only as good as Canadian institutions chose to make them. He didn't argue with that. He just added more credentials. By 1994, he had his professional engineering designation. By 2001, he had built a small civil engineering consultancy out of a 2-room office in North York with a second-hand drafting table, and one junior partner named Sullivan Chen, who is now his company's vice president of operations, and who still reminds Neville every year at Christmas that he almost took a different job that fall. By 2018, Osei-Addo Consulting had offices in Toronto, Calgary, and Halifax. They had completed bridge assessments for 3 provinces, a highway expansion project in northern Ontario, and water infrastructure work in 6 Indigenous communities across Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Work Neville had gone after, not because it was the most lucrative, but because it was the most needed. He was not, by any visible measure, a man anyone should be sending to a side door. But Neville had stopped expecting the world to read his resume from his face a very long time ago. He had learned something in 37 years in this country that he now considered almost a philosophical position. The people who underestimated him were almost never a problem. They were, in fact, a reliable source of interesting afternoons. The call he made from the sidewalk outside Harrington Tower lasted 45 seconds. When he hung up, he put his phone in his pocket, adjusted the envelope under his arm, and walked calmly to the east entrance. Not because he'd been told to, but because he had decided that what was about to happen would be considerably more satisfying if it happened on the 42nd floor. The east entrance opened into a service corridor that smelled faintly of cleaning solution, and had fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency just high enough to notice. A security guard at a small desk looked up when Neville entered. "Morning," Neville said. "Morning. You here for a pickup?" "No. Meeting on 42. I was directed here from the main entrance." The guard frowned. Why would they? He stopped himself and reached for his phone. "Let me call up." "Already taken care of," Neville said, "but thank you." The guard looked at him, then at the envelope, then at the service elevator. "You sure? I don't want you to get up there and have them send you back down." "I appreciate that," Neville said, and he meant it. There was something genuinely decent about the question. "I'm sure." He rode the service elevator to 42. It was slower than the main elevators, and had a rubber floor with scuff marks along the baseboards. He stood in it alone, and looked at his reflection in the brushed metal door and thought about his father, who had been a civil engineer in Ghana and had spent 20 years building things that outlasted him, and who had told Neville once that a man's worth was not in how he arrived somewhere, but in what he built once he got there. The doors opened onto a back hallway. A young woman with a headset was walking past and stopped short when she saw him. "Oh," she blinked. Are you Mr. Osei-Addo?" "I am." Her face went through several expressions in about 2 seconds. "I'm so sorry." "I don't. Please, come this way, the boardroom is. They're already assembled." "Mr. Whitmore is." "I'm so sorry about them." She seemed to run out of words and settled for gesturing urgently toward the main corridor. He followed her. They passed the front reception desk, where a different woman was now seated, older, with reading glasses on a chain, and who looked up as Neville walked past and said, simply, "Good morning, sir." "Good morning," he said. Through the glass wall of the boardroom, he could see them. 8 people seated around a long oak table. 3 of them he recognized. The others he was about to meet for the first time, which was fine. He had been meeting people for the first time his entire life. He was good at it. The young woman with the headset opened the boardroom door and announced his name. Every head turned. At the far end of the table, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a blue tie stood up immediately. This was Randall Voss, chairman of the Meridian Group's board, and he was already moving around the table with his hand extended before Neville had fully entered the room. "Neville, I cannot tell you how glad we are you're here." He shook Neville's hand with both of his. "We've been following your firm's work for 3 years. The Atikamek water project alone." He shook his head. "Just remarkable work." "Thank you," Neville said. "Please sit. Can we get you anything?" "Water, coffee?" "Coffee would be wonderful." He sat down. The manila envelope went on the table in front of him. He folded his hands over it and looked around the room at 8 people who were looking back at him with a combination of professional respect and what he recognized as a particular kind of relief. The relief of people who have been waiting for a meeting they've been wanting to have for a long time. And that was when the door opened again. She didn't see him at first. She was carrying a tablet and a leather portfolio, and she came through the door with the specific energy of someone who manages other people's schedules and takes that responsibility seriously. She had dark blonde hair pulled back and was wearing a gray blazer. Her name was Colette Arnaud, and she was the executive assistant to the Meridian Group's CEO, and she had been working in this building for 11 years. She had also been the woman behind the glass at the main entrance that morning. Not the receptionist. She'd been filling in for 20 minutes while the receptionist was on a break, managing a personal call and not paying close attention to who was at the door, which is the kind of detail that matters more than it should. She looked up from her tablet, saw the boardroom full of people, registered Randall Voss's expression, and then her eyes moved to the man at the table, with the gray coat and the manila envelope, and the color shifted in her face the way it does when a person's memory and their present situation arrive at the same conclusion simultaneously. Neville looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Randall Voss said, "Colette, good. Can you make sure we get coffee for Mr. Osei-Addo? And whatever else the room needs." He paused, looked between them. "Do you two know each other?" Colette Arnault said no, which was technically accurate. Neville said nothing. She set her portfolio on the side table and left to get coffee, and did not come back to the boardroom herself. A different assistant brought the coffee 12 minutes later. The meeting lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. What was discussed in that room is not the point of this story, except to say that when Neville opened the manila envelope, it contained a partnership proposal, one that his firm had spent 8 months developing, that his team of 46 engineers had contributed to, and that represented a potential infrastructure contract valued at just over $90 million over 5 years. The Meridian Group had been looking for a firm with exactly Osei-Addo Consulting's profile. Indigenous community experience, northern project capacity, a safety record that was, as Randall Voss put it, frankly embarrassing to everyone else in the room. By the time they broke for lunch, 3 of the board members had stopped using the word proposal and started using the word partnership. By the time they reconvened, they had moved to specific timelines. By the time Neville stood up, shook hands, and said goodbye to 8 people who were already talking about what they'd tell their colleagues, the envelope was empty, and the table was covered in notes. He took the main elevator down. The lobby receptionist, the actual one, back at her desk, a young man in his mid-20s with a visitor badge lanyard around his neck, looked up when Neville stepped out. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I validate your parking?" "No, thank you," Neville said. "I took the subway." He pushed through the front doors and out onto King Street, where the October air had gotten colder while he was upstairs, and the light was doing that particular thing it does in Toronto in the fall. Low and golden and honest, coming in sideways off the lake. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the same sidewalk he'd stood on that morning. He thought about calling Sullivan. He decided it could wait until he was on the train. He started walking. Now, a lot of you watching this are probably wondering about Colette Arnault. What happened to her? Whether there was a confrontation, whether Neville said something, or whether Randall Voss found out, or whether she was called into an office and made to account for what she'd done that morning. Here's what actually happened. Randall Voss did find out. Not from Neville. Neville never mentioned it to anyone at Meridian. He found out because the security guard at the east entrance desk kept a log, as security guards at service entrances are required to do. And when one of the junior board members was processing the visit paperwork 2 days later, and saw that Neville's name appeared not in the main visitor log, but in the service entrance log, she flagged it to HR. HR spoke to the guard. The guard explained what had happened. HR reviewed the lobby camera footage from that morning and identified Colette Arnault at the reception desk during the relevant window. Colette Arnault had been with Meridian for 11 years. She was, by most measures, good at her job. She was organized, reliable, and professionally competent in the ways that executive assistants are required to be professionally competent. She was called into a meeting with the HR director and the CEO's chief of staff. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, she was informed that Meridian had a zero-tolerance policy on discriminatory treatment of clients, visitors, and partners, and that what the footage showed, the immediate redirection without inquiry, the refusal to verify his appointment, the contrast with how she had admitted other visitors during the same 20-minute period, constituted a violation of that policy. She was given the option of a formal corrective action process, which would involve mandatory training, a written record in her personnel file, and a 6-month performance review period. She resigned instead. Neville learned about this approximately 3 weeks later, when Sullivan forwarded him an email from Meridian's HR department, informing Osei-Addo Consulting of the outcome, and expressing the company's formal apology for the experience their founding partner had encountered during his visit. Neville read the email once. Then he forwarded it to Sullivan with a single line. "File this under things that should not require an apology but do anyway." Sullivan replied, "Want me to frame it?" Neville replied, "No." That was the end of it for Neville. But there's something that happened earlier that same day that Neville did not know about and would not find out about until the following spring, when Randall Voss told him over dinner at a restaurant in Yorkville the kind of story you tell when you know someone well enough to tell it. The morning of the meeting, Randall Voss had been in his office on 42 reviewing the agenda when his phone rang. It was Neville, calling from the sidewalk outside the building. The call lasted 45 seconds, as you'll recall. Neville told him, calmly and without any particular drama, that he'd been redirected to the service entrance from the main lobby, and that he was going to come up that way, and wanted Randall to know so no one would be confused about his arrival route. Randall Voss had been in business for 31 years. He'd been on 11 different boards. He had, in that time, developed what he would describe as a fairly calibrated sense of what a person's tone of voice reveals about their character. Neville's tone on that phone call was completely level. No accusation, no demand. Just information, stated plainly, and a thank you before hanging up. Randall sat at his desk for 2 minutes after the call ended. Then he picked up his phone again and called the CEO's chief of staff and said, "I need you to find out who was at the main reception desk this morning between 8:45 and 9:15, and I need you to pull the camera footage from that window." He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. When Randall told this story over dinner, Neville listened and nodded and did not say very much. At the end of it, Randall looked at him and said, "I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer." Neville waited. "How were you that calm?" Neville thought about it for a moment. Outside the restaurant window, a streetcar went past on Bloor, its lights reflecting off the wet pavement. "When you've been doing this long enough," he said, "you realize that reacting the way they expect you to react is the least useful thing you can do." Randall was quiet for a moment. What do they expect? Anger? Or embarrassment? Or just going to the side door without question? Neville picked up his coffee cup. "None of those serve me." Randall nodded slowly. "And the phone call?" "I gave you information because you needed it to run a good meeting. That was a professional decision." He set the cup down. "That's all it was." Randall didn't say anything to that, but later, Neville thought, he looked like a man who was reconsidering something. Not about Neville, but about himself. About what he would have done in the same situation. About whether he would have been that calm. Most people wouldn't be. Most people haven't had 37 years of practice. The Meridian Partnership was formalized in February of the following year. Neville was in Halifax for the signing, which his firm's Halifax office celebrated in a way that involved someone bringing in a very large cake and someone else bringing in a sound system, which Neville considered excessive and enjoyed thoroughly. Sullivan sent him a photo of the signed contract with the caption, "Side entrance guys win again." Neville sent back a thumbs up. He is not a man who makes a great deal of noise about the things he's overcome. He has always found that the work speaks better than the noise. 37 years in this country, and the pattern has held. Build something real, build it well, and let what you've built say what you won't. He still takes the subway. He still wears the gray coat, though he admits it is getting to the point where he probably ought to replace it. He still polishes his shoes the way his father taught him. 2 coats, circular motion, soft cloth, because some things are not about other people's opinions. They are about the kind of man you are when no one is watching. He has never used a side entrance he wasn't choosing to use. There's a question at the end of this one, and it's not a complicated one. Think about the people you've redirected. Not to a side entrance, maybe, but to a smaller seat at the table, a shorter conversation, a lower assumption. Think about who you were wrong about. Think about what it cost them and what it cost you. The Neville Osei-Addos of the world are not rare. They are everywhere. They are the woman you didn't make eye contact with at the boardroom door. They are the man you sent to the east entrance because of a gray coat and a Tuesday morning, and a decision made in less than 3 seconds. They are building things that will outlast all of us. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Tell us about a time you were sent to a side entrance, literally or otherwise. We read every single one. And if you're new here to Birthright Tales, welcome. This is what we do. We find the stories that don't make the headlines and we sit with them until they mean something. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. Because the next one, you're going to want to be here for it.